The wind at 11,200 feet does not just blow, it screams. At Carbonate Camp, Colorado, in the winter of 1888, that sound was the anthem of failure. Smoke poured frantically from dozens of thin metal stovepipes, symbols of a desperate losing battle. Inside the hastily built single-plank shacks, men huddled around potbelly stoves glowing cherry red, yet their backs, only 6 feet away, were freezing in 30-degree air. They were burning a fortune in green pine just to stay alive, and many were losing. But in the camp, one chimney was different. It smoked, thick and hot, for 1 hour at dusk, and then went silent for the next 23. Inside that dwelling, dug into the hillside like a badger's set, Anselm Haas sat in his shirt sleeves, the air still and evenly warm. His children slept soundly, breathing air that was fresh, not choked with smoke. His heater was a 3-ton mass of riverstone and clay that was barely warm to the touch. The camp was fighting the cold with constant frantic energy. Haas was ignoring it, having trapped the heat of a single fire deep within a mountain of stone. What did this quiet, stubborn Tyrolean stonemason understand about the physics of thermal mass, learned from medieval alpine farmhouses, that the proponents of modern, fast-built American structures had fatally ignored? The year was 1888, and the Colorado Silver Rush was a fever. Men chased veins of ore into the high, thin, brutal air of the Rockies, creating towns like Carbonate Camp overnight. It was a place built on the principles of speed and profit. The doctrine of American frontier construction was the balloon frame. Invented in Chicago, it was a revolution of lightweight 2x4 lumber and mass-produced nails. A man could frame a house in a day. It was the modern way. The doctrine of heating was the cast-iron stove. Shipped by the thousands on the new railroads, the potbelly or the Franklin stove was a symbol of industrial progress. It was quick, responsive, and threw heat the moment you lit it. Silas Vane, the camp foreman and proprietor of the general store, was the high priest of this new religion. "Get it built, get it warm, get to digging," was his motto. He sold the stoves, the lumber, and the tar paper to wrap the flimsy structures. The official manuals from mining companies, if they existed, echoed this: build fast, heat fast. The enemy was time, not the cold. The cold was just a problem to be solved by burning more wood. And wood, hauled up the treacherous mountain passes at $18 per cord, was becoming more valuable than the silver they were digging. This entire philosophy was built on heating air. But in the thin atmosphere at 11,200 feet, air holds very little heat, and the wind, pushing through the 1,000 gaps in the single-plank walls, stole it instantly. The entire camp was living inside a massive structural flaw. Silas Vane's new bunkhouse for the company miners was a perfect example of this conventional wisdom. It was a long, bleak box, 40 feet by 20. The walls were single-layer, 1-inch pine boards, nailed to a 2x4 frame. The only concession to the altitude was a layer of black tar paper nailed to the outside, which had already become brittle in the 20-degree, 29°C temperatures and cracked, flapping uselessly in the wind. Inside, 2 large round oak stoves, prized for their heating capacity, were installed. On paper, they were rated to heat a space twice this size. In reality, they were devouring a quarter cord of wood every 24 hours. The cost was astronomical, nearly $450 a day just in fuel, but the human cost was worse. Mr. Elias Thorne, an engineer sent by the Denver office to audit the mine's failing productivity, arrived with his instruments. His logbook told the story. On the morning of November 10th, the outside air temperature was 15°, 26 degrees. Inside the bunkhouse, Thorne's thermometer placed on the stove registered 850°, 454 degrees. The air 6 inches from it was a scorching 90°, 32 degrees. But in the bunks, located 10 feet away along the north wall, the temperature was 38°, 3 degrees. Snow, driven by the wind, was filtering through the gaps between the wallboards and collecting on the miners' blankets. The men were sleeping in shifts. One shift to mine, one to sleep, and one to sit by the stoves, feeding them logs constantly, just to keep the others from freezing. The air was a toxic mix of smoke, unburnt particles, and the suffocating dryness near the stoves, while the corners were damp with freezing condensation. Lung fever, or pneumonia, was rampant. Vane blamed the men for being soft lowland stock. Thorne, looking at his data, blamed the building. Anselm Haas was not soft stock. He was born in the Austrian Tyrol, in a stone farmhouse whose foundation had been laid in the 16th century. He was a fourth-generation stonemason. His knowledge came not from a catalogue, but from his grandfather. He had grown up with a Kachelofen, a tile oven, that was the heart of his home. As a boy, he had helped his grandfather rebuild one. It was a mysterious, massive structure of ceramic tile, soapstone, and fireclay that occupied the center of the house. He learned the principle. You did not keep a fire going. You built one specific violent fire using small dry faggots for exactly 90 minutes. The firebox would reach temperatures over 1800 degrees, 980 degrees, achieving near-perfect combustion. But the heat and gases did not go up the chimney. They were forced through a complex serpentine maze of masonry flues, 30 feet long, inside the 5-ton mass of the stove. The mass would absorb this inferno, and by the time the gases exited the chimney, they were cool enough to hold a handover. The fire would die, but the stove, its massive ceramic body, would then radiate a gentle, profound warmth around 120 degrees, 49 for the next 24 hours. It heated the people and the walls, not the air. When Haas arrived in Carbonate Camp and saw the flimsy shacks and the Holzfresser, wood-eater stoves, he was appalled. He refused the company bunkhouse. When he began digging into a south-facing slope and hauling fieldstone from the mine tailings, the other miners mocked him. "Building your own tomb, Dutchy?" Silas Vane offered him a stove, on credit. Haas just shook his head and kept working, mixing his clay and lime mortar in silence. His prototype was, to the American eye, a primitive failure. He began by excavating a 15 by 15-foot pit, 6 feet deep into the slope. He was using the earth itself as his primary barrier. The ground, 6 feet down, was a stable 48 degrees, 9 degrees, regardless of the 30-degree air above. His walls were not 2x4s. They were 24-inch thick, dry-laid fieldstone, carefully chinked with his homemade mortar. He was building for mass. His roof was not shingles, but heavy 10-inch timbers, salvaged from a mine shaft, covered with a layer of packed sod 18 inches thick. But the heart of the dwelling was his stove. He had no ceramic tiles, so he built what his ancestors called a Grundofen, a ground oven. He used blocks of soapstone he had identified in a nearby cut, a material prized for its thermal properties. It weighed an estimated 4,500 pounds, over 2 metric tons, standing 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, dominating the small room. He built its complex internal flue system from memory, a series of baffles and chambers designed to wring every last calorie of heat from the wood. To the camp, it looked like a prehistoric mound. Vane called it Haas's Folly, a badger hole that would be damp, dark, and probably filled with smoke. Haas ignored them. He trusted the physics. The conflict was one of fundamental philosophies. Silas Vane and the modern American method were based on convection. Heat was a product to be generated instantly by a machine, the stove. This hot air was pumped into a thin shell, the building. The battle was one of volume. You had to generate hot air faster than the cold air could infiltrate. It was a brute force, wasteful, and constant war. The roaring stove was a sign of success. The red-hot stovepipe was a badge of power. But it was a terrible illusion. Most of the heat, up to 70% of it, was going straight up that pipe, lost forever. Anselm Haas's philosophy, the medieval method, was based on radiation and mass. Heat was not a product to be consumed, it was an asset to be stored. The fire was merely the charging mechanism. The stove, and indeed the entire building, was a heat battery. Haas wanted to heat the objects in his home, not the air. Radiant heat, travelling in infrared waves from the 4,500-pound stove and the 24-inch thick walls, would strike the surfaces of the table, the chairs, and the people themselves, warming them directly. These objects would then re-radiate that warmth, creating a stable, profoundly comfortable environment. The air temperature could remain a modest 65 degrees, 18 Celsius, yet it would feel warmer and more comfortable than the 80 degrees, drafty, smoky air in Vane's bunkhouse. A quiet stove was the sign of success. A cool chimney meant the energy was inside, where it belonged. Elias Thorne, the engineer, was a man of numbers, and the numbers in Carbonate Camp were leading to financial ruin. The mine's fuel bill was its single largest operational expense after payroll. He had heard the jokes about Haas's folly, but he also noticed Haas was the only man on site who wasn't buying wood from Vane. He was fueling his home entirely from scraps, construction cut-offs, and deadfall. Thorne paid a visit, bringing his calibrated thermometer and a sling psychrometer to measure humidity. He found Haas and his wife reading, the children playing on the floor. The air was clean. He took his first reading at 8:00 a.m. The outside temperature was 5 degrees, plus 20 degrees Celsius. Haas had last fired his stove 14 hours prior at 6:00 p.m. Thorne's thermometer registered 66 degrees, 19 tongues, near the stove. He moved it to the far north wall, the one built against the frozen earth. It read 64 degrees, 18 degrees. The temperature variance in the entire dwelling was less than 3 degrees. The humidity was 42%, perfectly comfortable. Thorne then went to Vane's bunkhouse. The stoves were being fed. The reading near the stove was 88 degrees, 35 degrees. The reading in the bunks was 41 degrees, 5 degrees. The humidity was 14%, painfully dry. Thorne did the calculations. Haas was consuming approximately 30 pounds, 13.6 kilos, of wood scraps per day. The bunkhouse was consuming over 700 pounds, 317 kilos, of prime cordwood. Per cubic foot of heated space, Haas's system was operating at an estimated 90% efficiency, while Vane's was struggling to reach 30%. Thorne's report to Denver that night was simple. The Tyrolean mason is not living in a primitive hole. He is living in a machine for survival. We are the ones living in primitive boxes. Thorne, now fascinated, spent an evening with Haas, sketching the system. Haas, speaking in broken English, explained it in layers. Layer 1 was the earth. By digging 6 feet down, the building was not fighting 30 degrees to winter air. Its 0 point was the 48 degrees, 9 degrees stable ground temperature. The earth was insulating the structure on 3 sides. Layer 2 was the envelope, the 24-inch stone walls and 18-inch sod roof. This was not insulation in the modern sense. It was pure thermal mass. It did not block the cold. It absorbed the heat from the stove, becoming a single massive low-temperature radiator. It was also, crucially, airtight. Wind could not penetrate it. Layer 3 was the core, the Grundofen. This was the engine. Haas sketched the flue path. The firebox, small and deep, was designed for a hot, fast burn that consumed all volatile gases. The 1,800-degree Estian flames then hit a baffle and were forced down to the bottom of the stove, then sideways through 2 horizontal channels, and only then up a final flue to the chimney. The path was over 20 feet long, all contained within the 4,500-pound soapstone mass. By the time the exhaust gas exited the chimney, it was only 250 degrees Celsius, 121 degrees Celsius. In Vane's stove, the chimney gas was 800 degrees Celsius, 427 degrees Celsius. That was just wood, burning for the benefit of the sky. Haas had built a system where every component, the earth, the walls, the stove, worked together to create a stable, warm, and efficient whole. On January 12, 1889, the true test arrived. The miners called it the Siberian Express. A front of Arctic air stalled over the Rockies, and for 3 days the temperature never rose above 35 degrees, 37 degrees. Winds gusted to 60 miles per hour, driving the wind chill to a level the miners had no words for. Carbonate Camp, cut off from all supplies, began to die. The failure of the conventional system was immediate and catastrophic. In Vane's bunkhouse, the wind forced freezing air directly through the wallboards. The stoves were fed until their sides glowed white-hot, but the heat was stolen instantly. The stoves were running constantly, but achieving nothing. On the second day, the inside temperature dropped to 20 degrees, 7 degrees. The men, terrified, began burning their own bunks and the chairs to feed the stoves. 2 men, trying to reach the latrine 30 yards away, were caught in the whiteout and found the next day frozen solid. Inside, 3 others developed severe, blackening frostbite on their feet as they huddled together. The modern system had failed completely. In Haas's dugout, the storm was just a muffled sound. The wind howled over his sod roof, unable to gain purchase. There were no drafts. The mass of the earth and stone was indifferent to the air temperature. Haas moved to his storm protocol, firing his stove twice a day, once at 6 a.m. and once at 6 p.m., using 40 pounds of wood each time. The 4,500-pound soapstone core became saturated with heat. The internal temperature never dropped below 62 degrees, 70 degrees. Haas and his family were safe, comfortable, and breathing clean air, using less fuel in a day than the bunkhouse burned in an hour. On the 3rd day, during a brief lull in the wind, the door of the dugout was flung open. 3 figures, covered in ice, stumbled in and collapsed. It was Charlie, a young miner from Vane's bunkhouse, and 2 others. They were shaking violently, their faces blackened by frostbite. Haas and his wife dragged them in, barring the door against the storm. The dugout now held 7 people. The system was stressed. The extra bodies produced more moisture and consumed more oxygen. Haas opened a small 4-inch ventilation flue he had built near the ceiling, a detail no one had understood. Cold, fresh air was drawn in, passing over the warm top of the stove before circulating, while the heavy, damp CO2-laden air was vented out. Haas, the quiet mason, was now the operational manager of a high-altitude refuge. The miners, who had mocked him, stared in disbelief. They slowly, painfully took off their ice-caked coats. The warmth was not the scorching blast of the potbelly stove. It was a gentle, even total warmth that seemed to come from the walls themselves. They were not just surviving the storm, they were resting in a place of sanctuary, built by the man they had called a fool. When the storm broke 4 days later, Carbonate Camp was a scene of devastation. 7 miners were dead. A dozen more had life-altering injuries. Silas Vane was ruined, his modern bunkhouse a frozen, ransacked shell. Elias Thorne's final report to the Denver office was not an audit, it was a manifesto. He laid out the statistics in brutal, clear columns. Standard bunkhouse, Vane, cost $300. Fuel, 1.5 cords, week, result, 7 fatalities. Haas dugout, Haas. Cost, $80, scavenged materials and labor. Fuel, 0.25 cords a week. Result, 7 survivors, 3 refugees. The company did not hesitate. Vane was fired. Thorne was put in charge of all camp infrastructure. His first official act was to hire Anselm Haas, at a high salary, to design and supervise the construction of a new 40-man communal bunkhouse. The new design was pure Haas, dug deep into the slope, 3-foot thick stone walls, and at its center, not 1, but 2 10-ton masonry heaters built from soapstone and firebrick. By the next winter, mining engineers from Leadville and Aspen were making the trek to Carbonate Camp to study the Haas system. A year later, The visual signature of the camp had changed. The flimsy pine boxes were gone. The skyline was dominated by low, powerful structures, their sod roofs merging with the mountainside. The frantic plumes of smoke were gone. Now only thin, clean vapors rose from the stone chimneys at dawn and dusk. The camp's fuel costs had dropped by 82%. Their productivity was the highest in the district, and their winter mortality rate was 0. The modern American obsession with speed, lightness, and the brute force production of hot air had been proven a fatal arrogance. The potbelly stove, running constantly, was a machine that fought a war it could never win. Anselm Haas, with his medieval knowledge, had proved that survival in the extremes is not about producing heat, it is about managing energy. He knew that true comfort and resilience come not from the roaring fire, but from the deep stored warmth of the mass, long after the flames have died. He had taught the modern world a lesson the castle builders knew by heart. You do not heat the air in a box. You capture the fire inside the stone, and you make the building itself your hearth.